it started.
Well, it's 12 o'clock here in the Eastern Standard Time. I want to thank everyone for joining me today and several of my interesting guests. So we're going to have a pretty charged 1 hour. I'm hearing a little bit of noise in the background. If you can just put your mics on mute, and let's get the show rolling. So the talk today is, as you could see there, it's really focused on the business side of this wonderful world of 5G, and we'll cover a wide range of topics. And quick overview of the agenda. We'll just review some of the high-level technology business trends that are dramatically shaping the space. I'll have a quick note about COVID, and then the stars of the show will be coming on in the second half of the hour. But I just wanted to quickly introduce them. So here are the speakers today. So I'm the host. My name is John Nikolopoulos. I've been in this industry for over 30 years. Started my career off at Nortel in the 90s in the wireless group, and then went through an interesting path with regards to various startups and Fortune 500 companies. Worked at Accenture over the last number of years as part of the North America sales leadership team within the communications, media, and technology space. And more recently, I've been associated with a boutique consultancy that I founded, which is focused on emerging tech, including 5G. So that's my background. Let me just quickly bring in my other two guests. So Majed, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm Majed Alamin. I'm based in Toronto, part of the Google team today, basically leading 5G and Mac solutions, Mac being edge computing solutions across the globe, with working with telcos across the globe, but also working with different vertical industries that are now catching on 5G and edge computing, and what does it bring to the table from their perspective, like automotive, health, logistics, and others. So happy to be here, and thanks for having me.
Thanks for that quick intro. And Claude, I really appreciate you coming on because you are based in Hong Kong, and I know it's in the wee hours of the morning. So thank you for participating, and let us know about your background.
Yeah, no, pleasure to join here, John. Can't say no to you. John, you and I go back a long time since our Nortel days. I'm a McGill alumni as well, such as you. Very happy to be participating here. My career path, Nortel, and then a little bit of Sienna, and then really been consultant with Actel Consulting now for over 20 years. Covering mostly Asia, but pretty much projects also around the world. So quite happy to give the Asia perspective here.
Okay, thanks, Claude. So we'll let me just start going through some of this material rather quickly. And this will be a pretty charged hour, a lot of interesting information. Just a quick housekeeping for those of you interested. So at McGill, I've been an invited lecturer in their graduate data science program and through the School of Continuing Studies. If you're interested, we published all sorts of interesting things. There's also a McGill 5G workshop. We launched a couple of those last year, which I think is pretty unique in Canada. I haven't seen much of that in North America either. So there's some interesting stuff we're doing on the 5G end. So if you're interested in learning more, just do a quick search on McGill 5G and you'll see all sorts of stuff. The other thing I just want to call out, we do have another webinar on a very sensitive topic in the first week of April, which is focused on what I call the elephants in the room, which is on health and the environment, the impact of 5G on those. The other thing I just want to mention, there will be a couple of additional published 5G blogs. So I just wanted to call out a couple of articles that I'm working on with some colleagues. So on the IoT ecosystem, working with Michael Lonke and Michael Pollock. And then 5G enabled healthcare, and we're co-authoring with a global pharma exec, George Nikolopoulos. So look out for those publications in the next few weeks. And there's some other stuff that is coming down the pipe as well. So a lot of interesting material for you to get distracted with. So let's keep going. So I just wanted to start off with this. This to me is was a very dramatic moment. In the fall, in October, Apple launched their 5G. They were late to the game. They were very late to the game. In fact, Samsung and others had launched their products a while back, and then Apple came in just in the middle of COVID. So this to me was just a remarkable, an iconic moment where the CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, is sitting there. He's launching one of the most dramatic developments in technology history, and he is speaking to an empty auditorium. This is where COVID meets innovation. Anyways, it was a very dramatic moment for me. It was a very eerie feeling just to watch this. This most powerful company on the planet from a market cap perspective had to deal with this monster called COVID. And if I can just quote a line from Mike Tyson, right? Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face, right, or in the mouth. And 2020 was supposed to be the big party year for 5G, and yet there's been some massive changes because of COVID. So anyway, I thought that was a pretty dramatic moment for those who didn't see it. I think that recording is still available, but it was a curious moment in technology history. And I think what it points to is, and if I could just use this, this religious analogy, the Archangel Gabriel seems to be pointing to an interesting judgment day that's coming. And that judgment day has a number of dimensions to it. But, within the context of today, it's almost as if Gabriel is announcing through his horn the coming of something different, something very different, in fact, which is really based on 5G, which points to really a fundamental shift across talent, process, and technology ecosystems. And one of the key pieces, too, that will come out of this talk today, and Majed alluded to it before in the introduction, is with regards to the edge. So digital platforms are shifting to industry edge platforms. And this whole cloud world that's unfolded over the last 10 years is now also morphing and focusing on what's called edge native. So the differences between cloud native and edge native, I think, will be a key theme that will come out in this presentation. So let's keep rolling on. One thing I just wanted to mention here is, as a reference point, sometimes we almost forget how far we've advanced. So here I'm just showing the first analog mobile phone, the Motorola Dynatac in 1984, and then the Apple iPhone, which was just released late last year. And if you look at the time, the time span, we've had, if I can use that Moore's law analogy, we've had over 20 performance doublings. Right? So 20 performance doublings have basically allowed us to go from an analog phone, which basically offered simple connectivity, to the wonderful world of our smartphones today. And with all the hyper connectivity, you really can't compare the two. But actually, if you wanted to build today's phone in 1984, I would just quote here the Applied Materials CTO, where he said if you wanted to build that phone in the 80s, it would cost an enormous amount, as you could see there, consume so much energy, and the device would be 14 meters. This particular, by the way, this analog phone, for those of you not old enough to remember, it only had a battery of about 30 minutes. It weighed several pounds, and it costed, in today's dollars, about 10,000 US dollars versus whatever the iPhone is in the 1 to 2K range, right? So enormous differences. Just a brief history on mobile technology. I'm sure some of you in the tech sector have seen a lot of this, but I just wanted to point out that we really are talking about a 10-year tech cycle. But I also like to look at this in terms of groupings of generations, right? Although it's a 10-year mobile tech upgrade cycle, I like to look at 1G and 2G as sort of one continuum, right? Where we really just introduced a mobile phone, and then we had to deal with the switch to digital as we went to 2G. And then things started to get interesting with 3G in 2000 when GPS was made available, multimedia, the internet access. It was very exciting, but if you remember, a lot of the service was very shoddy. Video was very shoddy. So we experimented a lot in 3G, but it was really with 4G where things started to take off. And I won't forget when I had my data plan up here in Canada, it was such a unbelievable experience just to see an HD video being downloaded so easily, and how just the general experience navigating on the net was so very different, right? So 3G was a lot of experimental ground. 4G really refined that, and I suspect, as we get into 5G, I'm not showing here 6G, but 6G will be coming out in the next 8 to 10 years. But I suspect, when we look at 5G, there'll be massive experimentation, a lot of success. But I suspect a lot of the stuff that will unfold over the next 10 years with 5G will be refined and dramatically improved with 6G. Anyway, so that's a quick history. What will 5G bring? Well, that's the topic here. And why is 5G so different? I hear a lot of people, who are not necessarily core to this industry. They think it's just a simple upgrade. What's the big deal? Just get a little more bandwidth. Maybe if you do little gizmo applications, they think it's really part of the same deal that they've seen over the last little while. In fact, it's very different. As I'm trying to show you here, right? You have innovation at massive scale and speed. You have the talent, ecosystem disruption, complexity. Stephen Hawking, the great scientist who passed away recently, said that the 21st century will be the century of complexity. And if there was ever an iconic ecosystem or example of that, 5G is all about complexity. And so being able to simplify that complexity to bring clear value propositions to your customer, I think will be an interesting game that will unfold over the next 10 years. The techno convergence, you look at all the developments in artificial intelligence, stuff that's happening with blockchain and even quantum computing, and I'll have a comment about that a little bit later. Just this massive techno convergence, throwing things like also the stuff on 3D and 4D printing, the evolution in material science, and so forth. A lot of dramatic changes there that are happening as we're just beginning now with 5G, right? Which has all these what I call combinatorial effects in terms of the innovation opportunity. The techno geopolitics that you see there on the far right, to me, is significant, and I've had some interesting conversations with Claude and Majed on that, so we'll have definitely some chat about that. And then perhaps the most significant piece is what you see there in red, the red box, which is what I call the seismic shift from B2C to B2B. Up until 4G, most of the vast majority of the applications were just focused on the consumer. There has been some what I call muted success on the business stuff. Obviously, enterprises have leveraged mobile technology, but it was largely a B2C play. And so with 5G, as we'll see, because of the dramatic scaling of innovation enabled by different layers of new angles of performance, it is largely a B2B play, and that's why there's so much excitement in a lot of the recent spectrum auctions, which I'll talk about. A lot of money is being poured into buying this precious electromagnetic real estate to be able to monetize it through their B2B go-to-marketing efforts. The other piece, which I call this the seventh piece, I'll be discussing this in more detail in my upcoming webinar, but the issue of the impact of 5G on the environment and health. These are the elephants in the room, or maybe they should be called the whales in the sea. I think a lot of the ecosystem players, they're so hell-bent on trying to make money and very tactical in their thinking, and yet there is a monstrous impact that is going to be hitting us with regards to the environment and health. And I'm not saying this from a negative perspective. I think there's going to be some interesting challenges, interesting opportunities. Won't have time to really get into that today, but one of the themes, for example, that we'll be discussing in the upcoming webinar in April is how green is 5G and so forth, and what are some of the issues, for example, with the massive densification that's associated with 5G, with all the impacts on real estate downtown, the so-called small cell revolution that's just going to dramatically reshape aesthetics and urban planning and so forth. There's just a lot of issues that we need to talk about. So I just wanted to mention that because I think that's a key piece that's not often talked about. We'll explore that more in April. And with all the challenges out there, I just want to maybe bring a little humor into this. But in The Martian, the Hollywood iconic movie in 2015 with Matt Damon, there was a line there, and I can't fully quote it there because this is being recorded, but he mentioned about given his difficult situation, he needed to really solve each problem, really use science to really solve the issue. And let me tell you, we're going to need a lot of positive attitude and creativity to really get us out of the monstrous challenges that I see coming forward in the next 10 to 15 years. A lot of interesting opportunities, but a lot of challenges. But let's keep going. In terms of talents, I think a lot of us are joining this call just to see how you can stay relevant. There's an issue of relevance. If I can just borrow from, from that, the so-called Red Queen effect, where we're always trying to figure out how just to stay on that moving train, right? So there was an interesting article published by Gartner and HBR in January. We talked about some of the trends, and I think they listed like 9 trends. So I just flagged 3 of them here very quickly. So, employers, because things are just moving so fast, there's just no way that small, mid, or even large companies can hire people fast enough to tackle all the different moving parts. And so I think that's why you have so many successful outsourced system integrators and talent houses that are providing all sorts of talents. I think that's going to continue to escalate, actually. The other interesting thing that talked about, because of this work from home and remote trend, states will compete to attract talent now as opposed to companies. So that's going to be an interesting thing. And there's already several small U.S. cities that I've seen are offering talent to relocate. They're giving them money, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 just to relocate to their smaller cities so they can get the tax dollars, right? So it's and perhaps give a more positive experience to people who don't want to live in downtown New York or LA or Toronto or Milan or Hong Kong. So it's an interesting trend. And then the last piece is the COVID vaccine. So we'll see how this is going to be impacting the supply chains, but companies also will be making these bulk purchases of COVID vaccine, more or less forcing employees to take the vaccine, right? So it's interesting just to see the dynamic with these governments across the globe who, particularly in the West, you've seen them pushing the ethical issues associated with forcing vaccination to companies who are driven by profit, obviously. And we'll see how this plays out, but I think it's an interesting piece to see how that unfolds over the next year or two. So, as a summary, the work from home evolving to work from anywhere, anytime, I think that plays into this 5G edge dynamic. And so all the talent shortages we're seeing in general across the technology ecosystem, I think will get amplified because of this new tsunami that's hitting us. So I just wanted to flag the talent piece. Some quick market data points. If we look on the left, trying to break these out in terms of speed and capacity and connectivity. So on the mobile data usage, so I'm just quoting some stuff from good sources. The GSMA, they talked about data usage will grow from 4 times to 4 times up to 50 gigabytes per month. So it'd be interesting if you'd do a little self-reflection. How much are you consuming today? But anyway, that's an interesting development. A little less so in the EU, and I guess Claude, I suspect in Asia it's probably somewhere in between. 5G speeds they're going to rocket 13 times up to almost 600 megabits per second. And if you look at today in North America, in Europe, it's typically in the 40, 50, or 60 megabits per second, right? So this is a huge, huge difference. And so the question is, what do you do with all that, all that speed, right? So that's a question. So we'll talk about that shortly. One of the most dramatic things for me, and I know Majed mentioned before about self-driving. If you look at the amount of data that's projected to be generated by these, autonomous vehicles, I mean, the numbers are enormous. I know I've seen Intel quote 4 terabytes per day, but I've seen numbers well over even 50 or even 100. Can you imagine that? One robo-taxi potentially generating up to 50 or 100 terabytes per day compared to your individual consumption as a consumer, which may go up to 40 or 50 gigabytes, right? So you just look at the scale from gigabytes to terabytes. Anyway, it's an enormous amount, right? And then you start looking within the confines, let's say, of a downtown where you have so many cars, the density is so high. So you can imagine the stress that's going to create with regards to the mobile infrastructure. And that's why there's no way that the existing 4G infrastructures can handle what's being projected with regards to the requirements, just simply from the capacity perspective. There's other reasons why you can't handle autonomous vehicles beyond that, for example, on the latency performance, and there's other issues as well. On the connectivity front, you can see there, things are really shifting. So another self-reflection, look at your own household, how many devices are actually connected to the internet, right? So they're projecting 13.4. I think just in my household, I think I've already exceeded that. And I think I suspect most of the people on this call are probably in that range if you have a family of 3 or 4. The global installed base, Gartner, is projecting up to 50 billion devices. I think that's maybe to be conservative. And then the piece that concerns me the most is, and I guess it shouldn't be surprising, when you have all these IoT devices, the cybersecurity threats are just going to escalate. And I think this will be a very intriguing area to see how that unfolds, particularly with regards to what's going to happen with 5G security and some of the other technologies that are coming to the play that are potentially causing disruption, but also potential security holes with all the complexity that needs to be managed. Anyway, so I found some interesting data points. In terms of the global economy, a good number to keep in mind is that the mobile piece is about 5% of GDP. So that's sort of the magic number to keep in mind. And 5G is projected to represent about 50% of the connections. I think in the Americas, a little bit less in Europe, and I think again Asia is probably somewhere in between there. But anyway, that's an interesting number. Then of course, as we get toward the end of the decade, you'll start hitting the 80 to 90%. One thing just to be clear here, I mean 4G still has a lot of legs. There's a lot of investment in 4G, and 4G I think will actually peak over the next few years, right, in terms of some of the investments and so forth. So 4G is still very much alive, but it's going through the regular cycle with these mobile infrastructures. I just put a metric here on the North America side, so recent information just from McKinsey and Accenture. You can see some of the numbers there, millions of jobs. They'll be created, up to $300 billion investment. You could just see the impact in GDP is just a very large number. It seems these reports coming out now every few weeks are upping the amount of the impact. So it's quite interesting to watch this. One thing I just wanted to mention, so in the beginning, I did mention about the shift from cloud to edge. A lot of confusion. What exactly is the edge? I don't really want to get into the full engineering details. That was not the purpose of today's talk, but just in a very high level, simplistic perspective, you do have this traditional cloud space, all the work is happening on the internet. And then from an edge perspective, it all depends on, where you're playing, but some of the terminology you'll hear about is the so-called near edge versus the far edge, right? So the far edge is where the customer premises, where the device edge is. And then the near edge is where there's a lot of the action with the radio access network, the 5G and the 4G infrastructure. But it's just good to have this picture in mind so you understand where edge computing plays, right? So that's I've simplified this, but we can break those blocks up into a number of other additional blocks, but just wanted to give you a high level perspective of where how the edge fits in with regards to the the 5G piece. So as a summary, the 5G plus the edge are really joined at the hip. I mean, you don't need 5G for edge, but as things are going forward, a lot of the edge use cases will be tied to the hip with 5G. So that's why when I speak about a 5G, I always bring in the context of the edge. So what does that mean?
From Linda. She asks, how does 5G affect our health?
That's for our webinar on early April. So we're going to have to park that one. But it's all good. Nothing to worry about. But we'll talk more about that in April because that's a discussion in itself. With regards to business models, this is really the focus of today. There are some, for example, who think that the new internet, and I'm sure Majed and Claude will have some interesting things to say. I heard some people mention that blockchain is the new internet, right? Or quantum computing. I mean, there's a lot of confusion with all these different technologies, but the way I see this is, as we move forward, we're moving into what I call this hyper connectivity environment. And so if you don't have connectivity through all its different layers, if you will. The rest gets lost. So to me, it's really a hyperconnectivity play. And what is at the center of this hyperconnectivity? It's really this 5G edge infrastructure. And you have all these wonderful other elements that I've listed there that come into play to basically add what I call these combinatorial effects in terms of the innovation that's available. Here's my money chart. A little bit detailed, but just take a breath. Hopefully you had your double espresso. This is the one, this famous triangle that's being bandied about across so many marketing and sales circles, engineering circles. But I just want you to remember, these 3 points on the triangles. Right? So on the top, you have what's called capacity enhancement or enhanced mobile broadband, EMBB. The bottom right, it's all about high reliability and low latency. And on the bottom left, it's this massive IoT connectivity. And so what the standards bodies did 10 years ago when they started this effort on 5G, they were trying to figure out, what are the specifications? How are we going to communicate the use cases and the opportunities? And in fact, for 5G, there's actually 8 or 9 performance variables that come into play. But what they did is they shrunk it down from a marketing perspective to these 3 pieces captured into this triangle. So just remember this. You could see some of the use cases that are talked about there. Things like 3D video and 4K, the self-driving car, smart cities. It goes on and on. There's so much interesting opportunities here. And this is why you could see what I mentioned earlier about the shift from B2C to B2B. So you could see all the opportunities for business here and all these interesting use cases. One thing to look at is the top right. I just gave you a metric. What is the difference really between 5G and 4G? And again, it's a complex topic, but in general, you can see the numbers there. They vary from 10 to 100 times. So it is quite enormous. And then on the left, you could see there where I refer to spectrum. Spectrum is the key piece. It's key driving. If you don't have any spectrum, nothing can be done. So a lot of confusion there, but I just want to list very quickly. So on top of these, this triangle, good to keep in mind that you look at spectrum, there's really 3 bands that come into play here. It's called the low bands, the mid bands, and the high bands. And a lot of action now in the mid bands. Initially, there was some interesting work in the high bands, particularly with Verizon in the US. Because of the capacity gains there, but just keep those in mind as well. Anyways, it's sort of a broad picture. Take the snapshots. It really starts to summarize what's coming down. And I see there may be some questions out there. I just ask you just to hold off on. I'll answer some of those questions as we move later into the webinar because I do want to give the guests some time. Let me just keep going here because we do have we're running short here. There's always this issue about what's better on 5G versus only on 5G, right? So there's going to be some use cases that are specifically, really you need 5G for it to work. So for example, self-driving transport, there's no question about it. You're going to need 5G. And when you look at some other stuff, it could be cloud gaming, consumer IoTs. You could see there on the left. There's a number of options on the table, right? So it'll certainly be improved with 5G, but there's also other competing things like Wi-Fi 6 and 4G and so forth. So it is a pretty complex situation, and smart cities plays across that full spectrum there that you see on the chart. Commercial status is very quickly here. So 2019, 2020 was all about basic rollout, focused on the top of that triangle, just the capacity gains. And then you could see on the bottom there between 2021 and 2025, it's really shifting to the bottom legs of that triangle. This is where all these B2B use cases are going to be coming out over the next 3 to 4 years. So that in a nutshell is the commercial status. I just wanted to flag very quickly, and we can talk about this during the Q&A. In the US, there was this monster C-band auction, which was completed in February, $81 billion, massive, massive amounts of dollars being spent by Verizon, AT&T. The other thing I want to mention, if you want to know, especially in the West where things are going, just look out what's happening in South Korea, and I'm sure Claude will have a few comments on that. China is so aggressive, and then interesting thing just hot off the press, Canada, there was a massive merger announced by 2 of the largest mobile cable players here, Rogers and Shaw. I'll skip this one. If you are an entrepreneur, it's an exciting time to raise capital. It's raining capital. That's per Peter Diamandis, well known. He's the guy behind the X Prize and Singularity University in Silicon Valley. There's so much money that has been raised in 2000. In fact, it's the most, as per the Economist. You could see there in the bottom. You could see in the bottom rather. And this in the middle of a pandemic, which is quite fascinating. And so the key piece here, this is good because the 5G Edge bill will need a ton of money over the next 10 years. And the diversity in the funding channels is unbelievable. You've got, global crowdfunding. You could see some of the numbers there, global venture funding, and then something which is quite curious, which has emerged particularly in the US, is these blank check companies called SPACs, which are now representing about half the IPO market. It's really quite dizzying. I don't know if you've followed some of the interesting players that I've noticed there, which have a lot of 5G interconnects. It's quite fascinating. So the 5G will be leveraging anything that's available on the table because there's going to be so much money that's going to be needed. But it's just quite interesting what's going on there in terms of where the money is going very quickly. You could see where the spend is. The global spend for CSPs is so much higher than the web scalers. And by web scalers, I mean Google's, Microsoft, and Amazon's, right? So you could see it's almost an order of magnitude larger. Then you see the edge computing piece, which is a much smaller piece. We're still in the early phases of this, right? And at the bottom there, I'm just showing you there's just so many players in the mix here. And as far as I'm concerned, over the next 10 years, the definitive, or one of the key definitive battles will be the race to control the edge, powered by 5G. I just wanted to have this slide, and then we'll switch to our speakers. So I know it's a little busy, but this is this techno-geopolitics stuff, right? It has many dimensions to it, but I just wanted to quickly just give you a high-level piece because it's not an easy thing to understand, but there's so many pieces that are coming into the puzzle here, right? So you could see on the top, in Canada, Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei, was arrested a couple of years ago, and in Canada, we're a bit of softies, right? So she's still living in her mansion, having a fine time, but she can't leave the country. And this arrest was initiated by the U.S., and because Canada has an agreement with the U.S., she's still in Canada, and it's still unfolding, and it's put the Canadian government in a difficult situation. Canada has really been caught with regards to the evolving Huawei issue, which is tied in many ways to this 5G development. And on the left, top left, you could see, another angle to this 5G is we now have 4 rival GPS systems. So the EU, the US, Russia, and now China just recently completed their Beidou system. That's another piece that comes to the puzzle. And then the battle between Bezos and Musk with regards to the low Earth orbit satellites here on the left, between OneWeb, Project Kuiper, and Starlink, and now even China's getting into the mix. So the battle of 5G now is even moving up to the skies, right, across multiple dimensions you could see there. And on the right, you look at the geopolitics, right? So the Five Eyes, which is the security infrastructure involving the US, Canada, a few other countries. Now there's another piece to that. It's the Quad, the so-called Quad has emerged, right, where the US has gotten together now with India and Japan and Australia to put a check on China. And then from a Chinese perspective, this historical Silk Road is moving to what I call Silk Road 2.0, which is the China Belt and Road Initiative. You could see the stuff all in blue there. It's just amazing, how China is expanding. It's quite remarkable. And I just want to finish this. While we are binge watching, China is binge building. This is a quote from Bill Maher last week on his real-time show. I thought that was it was funny, but it was very appropriate. COVID impact, all sorts of interesting stuff that's happening there. We'll talk more about that during the Q&A, but just very quickly, digital transformation acceleration has been a definitive highlight of this, and there's been some mixed bag with regards to 5G. Some auctions have been delayed because of COVID focus, but on another perspective, innovation has been accelerated, let's say, for example, on the app development perspective because of some of the remote work that's been enabled by our digital infrastructure. Anyway, so a lot of interesting stuff that's happening, new business models, things like telehealth, downtown real estate, reboot. You wonder with some of the small cell challenges that are going to be hitting the 5G market, they'll be able to leverage the reboot in downtown real estate. So a lot of interesting things that have been driven by COVID. I'm going to stop there. So it was fast. There's a lot of interesting information there. Let me just now bring in Majid. So I know Majid, as we get into this Q&A. So why don't you just give us your colorful view of what you see happening? What are some of the issues? And then we'll give Claude a chance to speak, and then we'll have some questions.
Amazing. Thank you, John. That was really in line with everything we're hearing and seeing. You summarized it in a very clear and straight to the point way. I think I would definitely start by clearly differentiating between science and business in the 5G world, because you talked about that Matt Damon quote from you have to do lots of science things to make it happen, but also you have to do lots of business things to make it happen. It's actually those two happening at the same time in a synced way that will make this a success or a failure. And I don't think we are still at that stage of talking whether 5G is going to be a success or a failure. Maybe that was like 3-4 years ago. Today, it's more around when can we really start getting the outcomes of what we've been working on. So you've seen all the investments on the 5G infrastructure, whether it's from country level to operators level to industries level. You've seen the huge amount of money put on spectrum auctions, whether it's in Canada and the US and Europe and Asia Pacific and others. So the money has been already put. There's no way to turn back and say this is not the way forward. But I think there's still a lot of science work to be done and a lot of business work to be done for this to be happening. And from a science perspective, I think that triangle that you showed, which basically shows the three corners of 5G, which is more around massive connectivity, the number of connections that needs to happen simultaneously is in millions and billions versus the old technologies. That's one corner. The ultra low latency on the other corner, which getting into milliseconds, and then on the broadband capabilities on the third corner. Although this is like a business approach of like what are the use cases, but I think it's hugely impacting the science approach of like what do we need to solve for and when to make this happen. So I'll take one corner as an example, which is the latency corner. We talk about latency from the perspective of like technology being, like today, if you want to do, let's go to an extreme case of remote surgery. If you want to do remote surgery where the surgeon is in Chicago, but the patient is somewhere in Europe, it's gonna take you about like 2 seconds to 3 seconds in latency, and basically that's not gonna cut it for someone using a very delicate machine as robotic surgery. So the tactility of having 1 to 2 milliseconds in the movement of the surgeon's hands versus the robot's hands needs to be there. So that's a business requirement. But how do we solve for it scientifically? It doesn't, it's not a clear answer, because there's the speed of light in here, and everyone knows that this is a limit. No one can, create a lab tomorrow and start saying, how can we break the speed of light? And it is a fiber optic between Chicago going all the way to Europe with that distance, that those milliseconds will be taken and ultimately arriving to a second or two for latency. So how do we solve for it? You have to solve for it with a completely new innovative ideas, like creating edge computing perspective. So being able to have computers that are taking decisions at the edges, and basically the communication between them happens in a different perspective of like sharing updates and syncing rather than really delivering information from one end to the end is key. Maybe I'm complicating it, but in simple terms, the time for any application to go to a server and come back is ultimately limited by the distance it's going to cross, no matter how technology evolves. And that distance needs to be shortened. And the shortening the distance means putting the computing capabilities closer and closer to the user of that application. So this is just one corner of the three corners, but it just shows how much science we need to still put in, how much engineering efforts needs to be done. So the first wave of 5G was more talking about how can we do coverages in 5G, like wireless coverage, and that was the key problem of like moving from building, let's say in the US, from 20,000 cell sites to 200,000 cell sites or even more. That was the biggest problem. It's like you need at least 20 times more cell sites to cover in 5G world. But that's one angle. The other angles are even more important because ultimately you're hearing the business requirements, and it's not just about coverage. It's about latency. It's about number of connectivities, etc. And this is where we believe is the story happening today. And going from that perspective into more into like who owns those businesses. Is it a service provider delivering an end-to-end solution in 5G? Like you mentioned that 5G in automotive and self-driving cars. Who owns that connectivity? Is it the OEM of the car itself, so the BMWs and Fords of the world, or is it the Verizons and Bells and Rogers of the world, or is it basically the driver, the owner of the car that's going to provide that 5G connectivity? And you would imagine like, a 5G connectivity might start being nice to have, but if it goes all the way to becoming a mission critical, like self-driving, someone has to regulate where this connectivity comes from so that the quality of service is clear and the ownership is clear, and the monitoring and optimization and accident management, etc., is very clear. You cannot say I made an accident and killed people because my 5G connectivity provided by me as like just a person walking the street having a SIM card in his phone. That's not the connectivity that car needs. So we're still in that phase. Having said that, I'm giving those extreme use cases to show the science of it, but there are still a lot of use cases that are immediate today that we can talk about that are really like, mind-blowing on how simplistic they might be, but how effective they are in the marketplace. Talking about, logistics and supply chain. Today, the biggest problems we're having is distribution with all these, big carriers, small carriers, local distribution and global distribution, and being able to have tracking systems that are powered by 5G, again, to the point of massive connectivity. If every package needs to communicate to a 5G network, we have billions of packages moving around the world every day, and that massive connectivity needs to be solved. Those magic use cases about surgery and the self-driving cars, etc., needs to happen. So it's a journey. It's at the peak of it. The window of opportunity is huge, but it's closing, and whoever starts putting the right answers on the table is gonna get all these great benefits of automotive coming to them, or health industries coming to them, or manufacturing coming to them. That's why it's a big ask from the service providers to really drive the engineering and solutions, and they're not going to be able to do it alone. So that's why a partnership between engineering organizations, universities, any technology provider in the world, whether it's Google or Microsoft or Amazon or Apple or anyone else, they have skin in the game today, unlike the old world of just providing wireless connectivity. So it's a big ecosystem that is forming, and collaboration and partnership is key to it to deliver both on the business side and on the science side.
Majed, every word that you mentioned with passion and energy. I really appreciate that. I have so many questions to ask you, but I just want to mention what you mentioned about what you referred to as latency. It's interesting how latency now is being weaponized, right? I'm using that term because you're seeing that all over the board, right? Because obviously in the financial world, every millisecond can potentially cost hundreds of thousands, or if not millions, of dollars, right? So, and in some cases, it could be a life and death situation as we look, further into the decade when some of the, autonomous driving comes in, right? You can't tolerate a lot of latency variation, and you can't tolerate certain thresholds with too high latency, right? So latency is going to be something that's going to be used across all sorts of marketing angles, depending on the use case. And I think there's also a lot of confusion with regards to what is latency, what's speed, what's response time. A lot of confusion in terms of all these different terms, right? So there's plenty of opportunities for marketing business people to simplify things, to convey simplicity, not only to consumers, but also to business. Let me stop there. Claude, your turn, man. Go for it, and then we'll have a few questions as well.
So what do you want me to talk about, John? Just give a landscape in Asia, or?
Yeah, no, I was just wondering. So give us, Majed gave us something about the the technology piece and so forth. But I was just wondering, like, what's your perspective on what you're seeing in Asia? There seems to be a lot of leading edge stuff coming out of South Korea and so forth. But I was also wondering, about what's happening with the geopolitics of India and China, right? So maybe just some general thoughts, like what are you seeing in terms of dynamics there?
Sure. Yeah. You're right. First of all, congratulations on a very good presentation, John. You're right to mention South Korea. Normally, when you have a new G coming in and you mention 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G every 10 years, people tend to talk about Japan leading the world. And that's what happened with 3G and 4G. But in case of 5G, you're right, it's Korea, South Korea, which is ahead. I remember being at the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona in 2018, and so that was February, I believe, and already the booth of KT and SKT, where we're showing these applications, 5G applications, in anticipation for the Winter Olympics that was being held in 2018 back in South Korea. Anyway, so it was launched at scale in South Korea 2 years ago. So that's pretty much a world beating, along with the US, but the scale of Korea allows it to have much more broader deployment. And today they have about quarter of the population, I believe, on 5G. But it's more importantly, it's the the applications that they've been able to launch. So, after 2 years of service, barely now they're getting into return on investment. So so you can see that it's a very costly development. Every G is, and 5G is no exception. So I want to pick very quickly on this topic here before I forget, because there was a question here, somebody asking whether the impact of the consolidation in Canada, whether that's a bad thing. I will take a contrarian view here, and particularly coming from Asia, where we've traditionally seen regulators being very lax and issuing too many licenses earlier on in countries like India and Indonesia. That ended up very, very poorly, so it's, too many competitors is great for the users, but in the long term, it's going to be bad for everybody. The telcos go bankrupt, and users don't benefit with that. So it's very costly. It's facing a lot of operators now to go into infrastructure sharing, into spectrum sharing. For example, in China now, so I'm jumping into China, we see China Telecom, China Unicom doing some sharing. So I talked about Korea as leading, really. Japan only now getting started at scale. What's happening in Japan particularly is the fourth mobile operator. So it's bucking the trend here. Japan has issued the fourth license as opposed to downsize the number of licenses, and that's to a company called Rakuten, which is the Amazon or Alibaba of Japan. So, but what's interesting about them, because this is about 5G today, and Rakuten is mostly 4G so far launching, so they're only now getting into 5G. But what's interesting about them is the business model. So here's a service provider which is not only betting on Open RAN technology, and you mentioned that a bit, John. It's still not at a stage where you can say that it works at scale and it can be exported. But Rakuten has the ambition, definitely, and announced it through the acquisition of some technology Open RAN company, to export and to become basically a vendor. So competing with the Huaweis and Ericssons of the world. So that remains to be seen, and they obviously need to fix their deployment in Japan, first of all. India is one of those countries that have gone through consolidation. It's impressive. They had 10 plus operators. Yes, it's a massive country, but 10 operators, most of them competing at the national scale, is a lot. So now today we're down to 3 in India. And really one of them is a new one, which is Reliance Jio, which is interestingly, number one in terms of subscribers. Overall, there's no 5G yet launched in India. That's in 2022 onwards. But then the other two are Airtel and Vodafone and Vodafone Idea. So Jio has the aspiration as well, like Rakuten, to become a vendor. So it remains to be seen, really. So talked about those. Hong Kong, where I'm sitting, we've been launching 5G for about a year now. Now you ask me as a user, I have a 5G. I've got my 5G phone, as you said, John. It's was launched late last year. I'm you know, I've got pretty good Wi-Fi broadband at home and at the office, so no need to use 5G. But really, at subscriber basis, I don't see any difference whatsoever between 4G and 5G. Really, it's just just got a pretty nice phone, but in terms of user experience, sadly, it's still the same. As Majid was saying, and as you alluded as well, we're talking about B2B, so it's really about applications for enterprises. And I want to touch here a little bit, therefore, on what is 5G about? So 5G really broadly about three things. One is capacity. So that's mostly you know, the channel bandwidth, much more massive now, and therefore you'll be able to offer more capacity. So I mentioned in my example now, really I don't see any difference, but really where my contract with the mobile operator was for 6G or 8G or 6 or 8 or 10 gigabit. Now it's 80 or 100 or 200, right? So that's because of the capacity, the first attribute of 5G. Second one is really the latency, and you talked about that edge. We at Actel Consulting doing a lot of work in data center as well. And this is where the two worlds of data centers and the hyperscalers, where Majid works, the cloud service providers, and the world of telco comes together in a way that the hyperscalers have been moving, complementing their centralized cloud architecture with more data centers that are closer to the edge, closer to the users. The telcos in the past have attempted to become cloud service providers. They failed. So the Googles and Amazons and Microsoft Azures of the world are safe from that point of view. But now we see more and more collaboration. We've seen just in the past week Nokia announcing simultaneously, collaboration with all three hyperscalers. So what's happening is these hyperscalers now are complementing their centralized cloud deployments with a four-tier data centers in terms of national, regional, central office, and at the cell site. So this is where collaboration with the telcos is happening again, and giving the telcos a second chance at coming into that. So the third one is so I mentioned about capacity, mentioned about latency, and the third one is really the service enablement. So this is where you have another, which is nothing new, but now being enabled at a much greater scale, is the private wireless. So once again, here I give you an example. Here in Hong Kong, we have the airport. The airport of Hong Kong has already initiated a project. The regulator has given for free some millimeter wave spectrum. So you can see there is always a big role in terms of commercialization of 5G. As much as you want telcos and you want capitalistic system and all of that to work very well, you need the regulator, you need the government to facilitate it. So here in Hong Kong, for example, they've allowed certain band of millimeter wave for free for any enterprise. Of course, it's very costly, so it's not every enterprise which will do it, but the airport has gone ahead with it. So you see collaboration whereby you have the enterprise owning the network. You have the telco becoming as a managed service provider, and where you have also a core being offered as a service, a core network being offered as a service by the telcos. So that attribute as well is interesting, and that's what's going to drive the B2C and the B2B more. That's why we're going to see much more over the next 2 to 4 years.
Claude,
Last thing you
what?
mentioned.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, because we're coming to the top of the hour. I mean, we could bleed a few more minutes after. I think, Majed, do you have a hard stop at 1, or can you bleed for another 5 or 10 minutes?
No, I do. Yeah, I do.
You have to stop?
Yeah, I have to stop. Yep.
Okay, so Claude, let's continue in a few minutes. Let me just, I know there was a couple of questions. I just want to get to Majed before he drops off. And Claude, hopefully you can hang on for a few more minutes afterwards. I think, hey, Joseph Rebick, I know you had a question on Rogers, so go ahead for Majed, if you're there. Not there? Joseph.
Maybe they're muted, John. Maybe you need to read their question.
Okay. Well, I know Joseph Rebick, he had a question about, Rogers. So Majed, like, what's your view on Rogers and, on Rogers and the acquisition, the new consolidation in Canada? How do you see that unfolding?
I think what Claude was saying is more relevant to the question around what happened in Japan which is adding more carriers versus reducing carriers. It's two different approaches. We'll see. I mean, definitely there's strategies behind it, and everyone sees it from a different angle. We only have to wait and see.
Interesting. So one more, Mike Lonke, are you on? Can you? I know you had a question for Majed as well. If we're having issues with the mute, but I think Mike Lonke's question was tied more to customer experience. So Majed, what's your view in terms of, with all the new capabilities that 5G is bringing to the table? How do you see the customer experience game changing because of 5G and edge?
Again, what Claude said around like the direct consumer 5G current experience is the same as any LTE experience. I think the biggest experience change is going to be from a B2B2C perspective. So if you're a car driver or you're a user of any other technology or a gaming or et cetera, this is where you start seeing the difference versus just getting a 5G on your smartphone. Now, having said that, of course, in the future, with latency and speed on the smartphone, application developers are going to take that in mind and start doing something different with it. We'll see where the innovation is going to take them. But my bet is initially both the money and the experience comes from a B2B2C rather than consumer product.
But Jen, at the top of the hour, I have one more quick question, and then I know you can drop off. But I know Dino Tsalikas from IBM, he had a question on regarding the finance sector. So just very quickly, and Claude, you can answer this as well. What do you see in the next few years in terms of the potential 5G impact on the finance sector, Majed?
I don't think there is anything defined yet from a perspective of like the under the hood of finance. So how can we improve everything from financial transactions to stock exchanges and everything? Because it's a complicated world and there's lots of sensitivity there. Everyone has their own approach and view. But I think from a customer experience perspective, it's a general trends around VIP centers that is coming to the world around, having this 5-star lounges for financial services where they get virtual reality and all the different experiences to attract more people to come back out of their rooms and houses into a place where they can do more of their businesses. So think of you being a premium customer of a certain bank, you get offered access to certain lounges where you have the latest 5G technologies because it enables you to basically do virtual reality type of meetings and all these different things. That's the immediate use cases where 5G can play a role, but everything under the hood of how transactions happens and how does blockchain play a role and all of those things, I think we need some time to really figure it out because it's a very sensitive area, unlike all other areas.
Indeed. Majed, I really appreciate it. I know it's over the hour. Claude, we'll let you answer that question, but I just want to take this opportunity to thank you, Majed, for joining. I really appreciate that, and I hope to continue the conversation with you some other webinars again.
Absolutely.
Thanks for your time. Thanks for your time and perspective today.
Bye, Majed.
Thank you, Claude. We'll talk soon, and thank you everyone for joining. Bye.
So Claude, you want to just add, there's a couple of questions here for you as well. So Claude, do you have any comments about the finance sector? Do you see any, you look at South Korea and some of their interesting, the initial focus there seems to have been on the B2B side, right? So, I was just wondering, so what are you seeing in terms of the impact potentially in the financial world? Is there anything that comes to mind, or is it, as per what Majid said?
No, I don't have anything more to add to what Majid said specifically to finance. Of course, where I'm sitting here is a financial center, at least for Asia. So it's all the talk related to finance is related to fintech, but that's not very specific to 5G. So maybe we should focus on 5G here. I see a question perhaps, and just to follow up, one of the questions here was on IoT. And of course, I didn't talk enough about China. I didn't talk at all. Perhaps I missed it. So that gives me an opportunity. That gives me an opportunity to come back to China. So we have. I did mention we have China Telecom and China Unicom collaborating there. So the big elephant in China is China Mobile. So China today, as you said, they're binge building. Yeah, that's appropriate, John, as well for 5G, because China has developed in excess of 1 million cell sites by now. The scale is massive, and at the same time, China Mobile has been betting on IoT already for a very, very, very long time. So that's going to be very interesting to watch what kind of applications they're going to be launching with that. So as you can see, less emphasis on just consumer, as we've seen in some other places, and more into industrial and business applications. I'm confident that we're going to see much more interesting applications. But the big ones everybody talking about, AR, VR, driverless cars, etc. But once these networks are launched at scale, like in Korea and in China, then we will see applications. So we're at the very beginning. As I mentioned, they're just barely getting into ROI now in Korea after 2 years launch. China will take a while, but in terms of deployment, it's massive already. So that's the matter there. You had also one more thing perhaps I can talk about, John, is you mentioned in your presentation about the US-China relationship. There's been much talk about the trade war that was initiated by the previous US administration. A lot of specialists and industry watchers started talking about a tech war, definitely. I've always said that the trade war is transient, but the tech war is going to be permanent, and we're starting to see that with the new administration. Already, you see signs that these tariffs put up previously are not working, and therefore they may be relaxed. Trade wars are easy to fix anyway. I just ask China to buy more soybeans and it's fixed. But
there you go.
But tech wars in terms of intellectual property rights, in terms of exports of sensitive technology, allowing China to bridge the gap on semiconductors and things like that, you're going to see this administration doubling down on what the previous one did. So the tech war, I actually don't like calling it tech war. It's more a tech decoupling. Supply chain decoupling are here to stay. So that's my views. So you have these decoupling, these two poles of US and China, rest of the world having to choose sides. But in certain industries as well, you have giants like Samsung or like semiconductor company out of Taiwan, etc. So we'll see how all of that will shape up.
Well, just one last question. I know we've gone over, but I'm just curious, just for the people who are still on, in the West, we're particular, as you know, about privacy and security, right? And in China, things are obviously different, right? So in the West, we have this sort of Orwellian perspective of what's happening in China. But I'm just curious if you can just comment, like if you look at I guess, Japan and South Korea, who seem to be more aligned to the West versus China. How do those countries treat, privacy and so forth, compared to what we're seeing in the West? Yeah.
Yeah, totally polar opposites, really, and it has pros and cons. Having no privacy and is definitely anathema. It's in the West, it's inconceivable, and contrary to the values and cultures, but. And at the same time, if you look at, for example, going back to COVID, certain countries here in Asia, how they've been able to manage that, through apps on your phone that track you everywhere you go, and if somebody's been in contact with you, etc. There's much, less concern for privacy, and therefore people more willing to use such technologies and such apps that have benefits at the end of the day. So yeah, it's a trade-off.
So let me ask you, so that just leads into my final question. I have a couple of co-authors that I mentioned earlier, publishing work in the IoT space, Michael Pollack and Mike Lonke, and also in the healthcare space with George Nikolopoulos. So we've been, trying to address these issues of privacy and so forth, and how 5G is going to unfold with respect to emerging digital health and telemedicine, and all the IoT implications. I'm just wondering, with you look at Hong Kong. Hong Kong was the front end of these previous pandemics, if you will, that didn't really hit North America so much, or the West, but Hong Kong is sort of battle hardened from that perspective. So with all the learnings that we in the West, we hear all this interesting stuff that's happening at the airport in terms of screening and so forth, contact tracing. So I'm just wondering, are you seeing 5G play a potentially interesting role with regards to the interlocks with emerging, either telemedicine or digital healthcare, and the broader challenges with monitoring, if you will?
Potentially is the key word here, John. So like everywhere else, we were being bombarded with driverless cars, with robotics and this and that, and remote health, doctors practicing surgeries remotely, etc. That's not reflected by the reality yet, but it's going to happen. We're at the very beginning of a 10-year cycle, as you said, John, right? We're just getting started with 5G. So over the years, we're going to start seeing that as networks move to standalone, and telcos being able to do slicing and offer more dedicated slices of their networks to particular industries and verticals. So you're going to see much more applications like that, including health and including anything else.
Just I'm going to squeeze you for one last question, Claude, because you're so interesting. I didn't have a chance to speak about this before. I sort of skipped it, but when you look at 5G over the next 10, 15 years, and all the interesting challenges there, particularly on the security front from an IoT context, right? And then on top of that, now you've got these new monsters. I call them monsters, but really it's monsters of innovation and disruption, which is the blockchain world is now intersecting with 5G, and there's so many different use cases, right? And so there's now some concerns with regards to, if you look at the security implications of blockchain versus some of these somewhat immature 5G security infrastructures. What does that mean? And then on top of that, we have what I call a real Y2K problem emerging, which is is this quantum issue, quantum computing issue, right? Which is it's projected probably toward the end of the decade to start hitting the street, right? So that's got all sorts of implications, again, from a security perspective, right? So when you look at these three ecosystems, this 5G ecosystem and intersecting with blockchain, which is scaling, over the next 10 years as well, and throw in quantum computing in the mix, particularly in the second half of this decade, how do you see that unfolding in terms of sorting through all that complexity? To me, it just looks like a pretty probably just a difficult challenge to sort through, right, in terms of all these moving parts and layers of complexity. So I just wanted your thoughts on that. I'm not sure if there's any perspective coming out of China, for example, or Japan with regards to the recent investments in quantum computing?
Yeah, absolutely right. No, the only thing that I can say is just pick up on what I said earlier. To your point, is that this is where the big rivalry US-China is going to unfold over the coming years, really, because China is coming up very, very strong on 5G, as we know, very strong on AI, blockchain, in terms of digital health, in terms of digital currency, the digital yuan. So China is really moving very, very fast and well planned, top down, state level. Sometimes also making sure that private companies are in line, such as we've seen with Alibaba recently and in the past, and now even hints that's the same is coming down to Tencent as well. So all of that is very interesting. And at the same time, US continues to lead and wants to continue to lead, doesn't want to relinquish that role. So it's going to be very interesting coming at the confluence of those three technologies you just mentioned, John. So,
Claude, fascinating. I could speak to you for hours, but I think we've already squeezed you for too much. It must be, what time is it now in Hong Kong? I think it's close
it's
to
1 o'clock. It's all right. Pleasure.
Okay, it's nice. It's time for your next double espresso to get you through the next 24 hours. Claude, Claude, I really appreciate your perspective. It's too bad Majid can hang a little longer, but I appreciate both of you coming on today to have some very interesting color, and I hope that we can continue the conversation in the coming weeks and months. To everyone who joined, thank you very much. I believe this this talk will be posted on McGill's YouTube channel, so look out for that. Feel free to reach out to myself or the other speakers through LinkedIn. I just humbly suggest you provide the context that you listen to this presentation so they understand where you're coming from, just as a courtesy gesture. And I guess that's it. So again, thanks for everyone. Best wishes to everyone, to you and your families with regards to this ongoing COVID context. It looks as if we're coming to the light at the end of the tunnel. So hopefully everybody will be moving forward in a positive way as the year rolls out. So again, thank you very much, and have yourselves a positive rest of the week. Take care, Claude.
Bye-bye, John.